All right, so we are going to move on with our notes about the Roaring Twenties and the United States exiting World War One. So, participation in World War One transforms the United States in the 1920s. The U.S. exited World War One as the richest and the most developed country in the world, largely due to the fact that physically we had not been impacted by the war. Mass production, high wages, new consumer goods, and forms of entertainment result in the decade being labeled the Roaring Twenties. In the 1920s, Americans elected Republican Warren Harding, who promised a return to normalcy. And he's quoted as saying, America's present need is not heroics, but healing, not nostrums, but normalcy, not revolution, but restoration. And so, really, what he's kind of talking about is the United States moving back to the domestic and foreign policy positions that it had prior to World War One. All right, we're going to move past those images. In the 1920s, American foreign policy returned to normal by returning to isolationism. The United States had rejected the Treaty of Versailles and never actually joined the League of Nations. So even though Woodrow Wilson is credited with proposing the idea of the League of Nations, because the United States wanted to stay neutral, wanted to return to a position of neutrality and isolationism, they do not join the League of Nations because that represents certainly getting involved in foreign affairs. Many citizens felt that the United States was tricked or duped into joining World War I and became even more committed to neutrality. So, however, our isolation was fairly selective because the United States did choose when we would get involved in world affairs. We hosted a naval conference that aimed to reduce the military strength of all nations. And we also loaned European nations billions of dollars to help rebuild after World War One. So, as a part of the Treaty of Versailles, Germany was required to pay reparations or basically punishment payments for being blamed for causing the war. So Germany pays reparations to Britain and France, who use that money to then repay war loans to the United States, who then loans it to Germany. And so we see a cycle of loan and repayment happening. The U.S. joined other powers in a commitment to world peace by signing the Kellogg-Briand Pact. So this is not joining the League of Nations. This is just a commitment that the United States and other powers will not use war as a foreign policy tool. So in the 1920s, Republican presidents were elected. We see Harding, Coolidge, and Hoover, who helped America return to normalcy by using pro-business policy. So if you'll remember when we were learning about the Gilded Age, we learned about laissez-faire policies in which the government did not regulate business. Republicans are also going to keep taxes low so that Americans could have extra money in their pocket and spend their wages. And Republican presidents kept government interference in business to a minimum, allowing private business to flourish or grow without government intervention. Pro-business policies meant the end of progressive reform. So if you'll remember in our previous unit, we learned about progressive reforms, which resulted in cleaning up industry. For example, Upton Sinclair's The Jungle exposes the unclean practices of the meatpacking industry. Jacob Riis exposes how the poor in cities are living in tenements. Ida Tarbell exposes the business practices of Standard Oil. And so we see in the 1920s the end of that sort of muckraking era. Americans had felt pretty confident that the reforms had limited the influence of monopolies, cleaned up the cities, and regulated economies. So basically, the muckrakers had done their job, and we didn't really need that kind of government intervention anymore. And as workers' wages rose as a result of some of those reforms, and as their workday, the amount of hours they're working decreased or declined, Americans have more leisure time and an ability to spend their money. And so we see in this image, we see that the per capita income is between 1920 and 1930 is going to sharply increase. And if you look at the image next to it, you see what represents the very wealthy and how they live their lives. Pro-business policies and mass production techniques during World War I led to an industrial revolution in consumer goods. So we see innovation in sort of household appliances and the ability for people to afford them because they are buying a lot of these very expensive items on credit and using installment payments to purchase expensive items. So if you look at this image of the vacuum, you see it was $2 down and $3 a month to own the vacuum cleaner. Industrial growth led to high wages for workers and cheap products for Americans to buy. The appetite for consumer goods and availability of cheap credit led to a decade of spending, also contributing to the name the Roaring Twenties. During this time, and this note's fairly important, so make sure you have this highlighted. Henry Ford's mass production techniques made automobiles affordable for many Americans. They're able to produce cars quickly, efficiently, and cheaply, and so they're able to sell them for a lower cost, allowing more people to take advantage of cars. The 1920s led to an era of mass entertainment in movies, music, and sports. And so, with things like movies and radio, we see the introduction of national celebrities like movie stars, radio stars, and professional athletes being stars as well. So, if you look at these images, you see that there is starting to be a separation in attitudes about American life. And by 1920, more people lived in cities than in rural areas due to the Industrial Revolution, mass immigrations, and jobs during World War I. So you see that real transformation, the real urbanization of American society. And the dominance of this urban America is going to divide America basically into two categories. We have urban society or city folk, basically. Urban society was characterized by diversity, consumerism, freedom, and entertainment. And then rural society is going to be characterized by religious fundamentalism, nativism, which is a fear or dislike of immigrants, and tradition. So I kind of think of it, so it's kind of like a modernism in urban society versus a traditionalism in rural society. And the values of these two societies clashed in the 1920s. The 1920s are a decade of consumerism, which means people bought a lot of stuff and very often bought a lot of stuff that they couldn't afford. And this is a result of a burst of personal prosperity, which results in consumer spending. Mass production led to a huge number of new products, cars, electric appliances, new fashions. You're going to see women's hair shorters get styled, skirts get shorter, and a real transformation of women during this age. Advertising boomed because people all of a sudden had extra money, and so companies would compete for customers to spend their dollars on their products. Companies offered ways for consumers to buy on credit through monthly installment plans. So if you look at this chart, you can see you could buy a sofa for $5 down and $8 a month. You could buy a washing machine for $5 down, $8 a month. So you put a little bit of money down and you pay a little bit over time, and then the item belongs to you. During this period, we also see the Harlem Renaissance. And the Great Migration during World War I led to a new concentration of African Americans in northern cities. So this map shows you we have a lot of African Americans leaving the Jim Crow South and migrating to places like New York, Philadelphia, Chicago, Detroit in search of employment. The Harlem Renaissance was a flourishing of Black culture in the United States. Jazz was a new form of music which blended African and European musical traditions into a distinctly American style of music. Louis Armstrong and Duke Ellington were two popular jazz musicians. The most popular author of the Harlem Renaissance was Langston Hughes, who wrote poems and novels about Black pride. The Harlem Renaissance in Harlem represented the new Negro, the idea that African Americans should freely express themselves, embrace their culture, and strive for equality. So this represents kind of a turning point for African Americans in advocacy and in ideals. We also see a drastic change for women during the 1920s. Women's roles are going to significantly change. In 1920, women gained the right to vote with the 19th Amendment, but even though they had the right, many women still did not vote. New fashion trends, voting rights, and more leisure time lead to an increased sense of freedom for women. Advertisers sold products by targeting women's sexuality and appearance. So, an advertisement for Listerine. Many young unmarried women embrace their independence and sexuality and become known as flappers. Flappers popularized new women's fashions like shorter hemlines, bobbed hair, which is hair that is cut right at the chin length, and really modern hats for the time. Young women shocked traditional minded women by smoking cigarettes, drinking alcohol, dancing at clubs, and using makeup. They also shocked traditional society by having sex outside of marriage and dating boys without chaperones. In the 1920s, we see a change in American literature. And in 1920s produced some of the great and most notable pieces of American literature. The 1920s has a group of people within it known as the Lost Generation. And the Lost Generation authors include T.S. Eliot, Ernest Hemingway, and F. Scott Fitzgerald, who rejected the World War I and criticized 1920s consumerism and conformity. So, sort of rebels. In the 1920s, we see sports starting to take hold in America. Sports was a popular form of entertainment in the 1920s as Americans gained more leisure time and income. Baseball, boxing, and football were popular sports, and radio broadcasts bring sporting events to national audiences. Sports gave Americans a new generation of heroes. Babe Ruth of the New York Yankees was the biggest sports hero of the 1920s. Baseball, however, was segregated with Satchel Paige and Josh Gibson as Negro League heroes. Heavyweight boxer Jack Dempsey was so popular, his fights set financial and attendance records in the 1920s. Other sports heroes of the 1920s include Red Grange, Gertrude Ederle, and Bobby Jones, who we should all be familiar with as a result of Eastlake. 1920s, we also see a growth of movie and radios. Movie and radios were widely popular in the 1920s. Over 500 stations connected the nation by broadcasting music, sports, as well as news, religious, comedic, and dramatic programming. Tin Pan Alley produced 90% of the popular music in the 1920s, focusing on ragtime, dance music, and jazz. Irving Berlin was the most popular of the ragtime composers in the 1920s. Talking movies helped grow Hollywood and celebrity movie stars. So prior to the 1920s, film existed, but they were silent films. By 1929, over 100 million people went to movies each week. The Jazz Singer was the very first talking picture. So basically, a talking picture is one in which you hear what the actors are saying. There's a revolution in transportation during the 1920s. Automobiles are going to transform America. Henry Ford's assembly line made cars affordable. And by 1929, 1 of 5 Americans owned a car. Car manufacturing then becomes the biggest industry in America. Cars gave people freedom and became a symbol of status. They also caused the rise of other related businesses. So we see the construction of new roads, gas stations, and shopping centers were built to accommodate the ubiquity of the car. Airplanes also captured the attention of America in the 1920s. In 1927, Charles Lindbergh made the first solo flight across the Atlantic and became the biggest celebrity of the 1920s.